welcome. We have a couple people coming in. First, I want to say a big thanks to our fine president, Morty, who is here with us today. Thank you for taking time. And to our speaker, I'll do a brief introduction. We really appreciate him. We're honored to have him here today. And to brave the weather and the flight delays and all of the things that came along with getting all the way from Washington, we truly appreciate you bearing the rain delays to come and be with us today. And to kick off our winter series of the Crane Lecture Series that we're very proud of. I'll do a brief introduction of Hedrick Smith, our speaker today. As I was reviewing his bio, it sort of occurred to me, looking at all the things he's done, that, you know, everything comes full circle, and he sort of embodies kind of what we're trying to teach, I think, and what we really want the students today and forever to be, which is really sort of a multi-platform, multi-skilled journalist. Someone who understands policy, someone who understands globalization, who's not just reporting on things here in the United States with a narrow view, and also someone who understands different types of journalism, whether it's print or others, in his case, documentary. So just briefly, Hedrick today is going to speak, I think, a little bit about his latest book, Who Stole the American Dream, which you'll be able to purchase after the event here today. But before I get to that, a long and illustrious career as a journalist with the New York Times, a two-time Pulitzer winner, an expert on Russia, an author of a book called The Russians, which was published in 1976 and was a bestseller, again, to my point about just understanding globalization. And then working not only as a journalist at the New York Times, but then becoming a documentarian and working for PBS on no less than 26 primetime specials and miniseries on all sorts of topics ranging from terrorism, Wall Street, perestroika, Walmart, and then the fall of Enron. So I think as you listen to him today, maybe start thinking of a wide range of questions, but I think what it boils down to is that this is a man who understands what's going on in the Hill. He lives not very far from it, but also someone who has reported on global issues and now has embodied all of that knowledge into his latest book, Who Stole the American Dream, which talks about how since World War II, when things were rosy and the economy was booming, many of us too in this generation, as we've sort of seen the economy tank and we've seen corporate implosion, the risk of losing all of our Social Security. And I think he can talk to you a little bit about that, and then maybe make some points about what he says in the book as his recommendations for maybe how to fix it. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Hedrick Smith. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks very much, Belinda. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Marty, for having me here and joining us this afternoon. I feel very much at home here on Sheraton Road. I used to date a young lady who lived up on Colfax Street, not very far from here. Her father got me to come out and play on the Northwestern tennis courts while I was courting her. We got married and had some children, and so I feel very much at home here in Evanston. It's not a strange place to me. We talked today in journalism about investigative journalism, and we think about 60 Minutes, and we think about short investigative pieces, maybe a takeout in the New York Times that runs 1,000, 2,000 words as a substantial piece. I don't think a lot of people think about books as investigative journalism, but my experience with this last book, Who Stole the American Dream, is it's very much that. And so for those of you who are interested in reporting as well as in the substance, think of what I'm talking about in those terms. It began with reporters' questions, and it's very much of a reporter's book. The title of the book was not Who Stole the American Dream when I started out. It was The American Dream at Risk. In 2009, who could fail to see that the American dream was at risk? We were losing 600,000, 700,000 jobs a month. Homes were being foreclosed at just about that rate. Middle-class people were having trouble paying for their medical bills, paying for their mortgages, paying for their kids going to colleges like Northwestern. The middle class was deeply in trouble. And I thought back, and I remembered a period in my own life and my own reporting career when the life of the middle class was much better, when we had shared prosperity back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when the middle class was sharing in the growth and the profits of American corporations and the American economy as a whole. And we had working bipartisan politics. Believe it or not, there were 65 Republicans in the House of Representatives and 13 Republican senators who actually voted for Medicare, a proposal put forward by a Democratic president, and a radical change in the social safety net in this country. And when Obama presented his much more modest health care plan in 2009, 2010, it got not a single Republican vote. Without judging the substance of the programs, how do we get to a political system where there was such a sharp divide when we'd had an earlier system in which people from one party and another got along and actually forged compromises together? So I began with questions like that. And I didn't just do a lot of reading and research. I went and talked to folks across the country. Some of my favorite characters included a guy who must have helped keep my plane in the air out at O'Hare. And the many times I came through here, a guy named Pat O'Neill, who was a frontline jet airline mechanic for United Airlines for 35 years, working the winter weather. Whatever it is I braved today was not very much, Belinda, compared to what these guys have to do every night when they're working the graveyard shift out at O'Hare for United and the other airlines, keeping the planes afloat. He got ready to retire after 35 years working for United under the deal that had been made when he was working, and expected to get a retirement and be able to kick back and do some of the traveling with his wife and his camper that he expected, but United declared bankruptcy. Bankruptcy meant for him that his ESOP, his employee stock option program, went from $80,000 to $2,000 in a very short period of time. His 401k plan sank not quite as far, not quite as fast, but sank substantially, and his pension got cut $1,000 a month when it got turned over to the PBGC, the government agency that takes over the pension plans of bankrupt companies. And the net result was that Pat O'Neill had to go work as a long-haul truck driver. That was 10 years ago. Pat O'Neill is still working today and cannot imagine when he's going to be able to retire. So he's one of my characters. I'm thinking of Christian Serrano, who was an excellent IBM computer programmer and managed some of the most complicated Oracle software for IBM and its clients, and became so good at it, she became a trainer for other IBM systems managers like herself. And then eventually she wound up by training the Indians who took her job, and she got replaced and laid off and lost her job that way, and is still looking for a comparable job today, 3 or 4 years later. I'm thinking about Pam Scholl and Mike Hughes, who came out of Chillicothe, Ohio High School in the 1970s. And within a couple of weeks of graduation, as high school graduates, got jobs at the RCA television tube plant at Circleville, just a few miles away. And for 35 years, rode the escalator, lived the American dream, had steady jobs, rising pay. I think Mike made it up to about $60,000 a year as a technical supervisor, checking the quality control of the output of the plant. And Pam Scholl was a $50,000 or $45,000 a year chief of the stock, a manager of the stockroom, when the plant shut down in 2004. Notice, well before the collapse of the economy in 2008. One of 54,000 plants in America that shut down during that period. And so Pam managed to get another job reasonably quickly, not at quite the same pay or benefits, but she got a pretty good job, which she had for a while. Mike Hughes had a terrible time finding jobs, went from one job to another, and finally today he is working as a night custodian at a high school at $13,000 a year, with some spare time jobs making another $3,000. Pam Scholl eventually lost her job, was unemployed for about 18 months, was thrilled to be asked to be a census taker for a month. She said, "I finally felt useful again." And when I was talking to Pam about what it was like to be long-term unemployed, she said, the hardest thing is not the loss of your pay. Yes, it's hard to deal with, but I did have unemployment insurance and I had good pay and benefits before, so I'd saved up some money. She said the worst thing is feeling not needed, not wanted, not part of the economy, not useful. She said it's so damaging to your ego. It is so hard to live with. People don't have any idea what that's like if they haven't been through that kind of situation. So there are lots of people like that in this book that I'm talking about. But what was interesting to me as a reporter was the discoveries that I made when I began to dig into a history that I thought I knew or that I should have known. And what I began to find out was there were a whole lot of things that were going on during the late 1970s when I was running the Washington Bureau of the New York Times that I didn't know about, that my reporters didn't know about, or that we saw pieces of but didn't manage to put together. And then I began to come forward in time, and I began to have more and more discoveries. Simple things like when I began to dig into the housing crisis, the principal victims of the 401k the principal victims of the subprime crisis were not subprime borrowers from East LA, people who didn't speak English, who were blacks or Latinos and got hoodwinked into subprime loans. No, it was qualified prime borrowers, middle-class people who qualified for good loans but got talked into, bamboozled into, cheated into, maybe lied into loans that were high interest, high fee, and terribly much to their disadvantage. And many of them today, at least 10 million, maybe more, are still stuck in those loans, paying high interest rates and unable to refinance their homes. I didn't realize that American homeowners had lost $6 trillion. $6 trillion during the housing bubble before it burst, before it came down, drawing money out of the equity in their homes. In late 1980s, American homeowners owned about 70% of their homes. By 2009, they owned 40% of their homes. That money had been transferred to the banks and to Wall Street investors. So 30% of the value of the total housing market in America shifted from homeowners to creditors. It's a $20 trillion market. That's about $6 trillion. So instead of money trickling down, money was geysering up. Exact opposite. It was defying gravity. Money was moving upward. And I got thinking about that. And I got thinking about some other work that I'd done on other things like retirement and offshoring of jobs. And I began to wonder if there was a pattern here that I was looking at that I ought to explore and try to understand. I had known that the 401k plan actually had accidental beginnings. It was never intended to be a national retirement plan. It actually began for a few companies, namely Kodak and Xerox and a couple of banks in New York, Irving Trust and Hanover Bank, who wanted a tax shelter to give profit-sharing bonuses, mainly to their executives, but also to some rank-and-file employees. It was just for a small group, and only later on did the Treasury Department apply it to the nation as a whole, and the mutual fund industry see that it was a great bonanza and market it as power to the people. Why let your boss invest for you? You can beat the market, and nothing appeals more to the pride of Americans. I see a number of gentlemen around here, men in particular, are great believers that we can beat the market when nobody else can, and so put it in our hands and we'll do it. Well, it's been a disaster. The median 401k balance for 2011, which is the latest year we have the numbers for, was $18,000. And even for people who had been in the system for 20 years and had been loyally putting away their money and are now in their 60s, on the verge of retirement, the median balance is about $85,000, which is far, far short of the $500,000 or more that they say you need if you have an average household income of $50,000 a year. So I kept running into these things that I hadn't really realized before, hadn't put together. And even all the talk about the taxes and how if you raise taxes, it will inhibit growth. And you can't afford to raise the taxes on the wealthy because they're the job creators. Well, as I was doing my research, I noticed that the maximum marginal tax rate under Dwight Eisenhower was 92%. And the maximum marginal tax rate under John F. Kennedy in the 60s was 77%. And the maximum marginal tax rate under George W. Bush and Barack Obama, it doesn't matter which party you're talking about, was 35%, but we had the slowest growth rate of 7 decades when we had the lowest maximum marginal tax rate. So I started to kind of brush aside some of the conventional wisdom that I had been taught and that I'd been repeating and began to try to scratch away and see what was going on. Well, let me go back to that period just briefly. I was talking about Eisenhower and Kennedy. Now, clearly that was the heyday of America. We came out of World War II, an economic and political, but particularly an economic colossus. There was no real competition from the world. Not only did our enemies, Germany and Japan, lie prostrate, but even our allies, the Russians, were in terrible shape, and Western Europe, the French, the British, their economies were in terrible shape. So we commanded the world stage. We didn't have any serious competition. During that period, we not only had regular growth rates in the 3 or 4% level, but we shared the prosperity in a way that we haven't seen it since, and certainly don't see it today. I remember very vividly in 1959 when Richard Nixon, who was Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, went to Moscow for what became known as the famous kitchen debate. Why kitchen? It was the kitchen exposition that we were showing the Russians at an exhibition of American life how many kitchen appliances we had and what a good life the American middle class had. And Khrushchev bristled at that and said to Nixon, he said, well, we're building a classless society here in the Soviet Union. That communism is going to build a classless society. And Nixon stuck his finger right in Khrushchev's eye and says, we already have a classless society in America. Now, Nixon was obviously exaggerating. But he was also stating something that people felt at that time. And what economists, I guess economists like President Shapiro, but others as well, have called the Great Compression. And what they mean by that is there's a compression between the incomes of the people at the top, the incomes of the people in the middle, and the people at the bottom. There was not as great a gap as there is today. The average CEO of a big corporation like General Motors made maybe 40 times the pay of the average assembly line worker. Today it's closer to 400, it's like 360 times. So it's 40 times. And this occurred for several reasons. And the reasons are interesting and important as we think about the predicament we're in today. One reason is that the middle class from 1945 until about 1975, for about 3 decades, the average Americans participated in the growth of the economy almost one for one. The productivity of the American workforce, according to the numbers I've read from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and others, just about doubled. It rose 97%. And the median salary of middle Americans rose 95% during that pay period. 97% increase in productivity, 95% increase in salary and compensation, in standard of living. So as the nation rose, so did people in the middle. It was, as people said at that time, a rising tide lifts all boats. That was a slogan often used in the 1960s. It has been used since, but then it was used very accurately. Now, why did that happen? It happened, I think, for a couple of reasons. One reason is the ideology, the ethic, the philosophy, the morals of the business leaders of that time. If you go back, and I did this, go back and look at what Charlie Wilson, the head of General Motors, or Reg Jones, the head of General Electric, or Frank Abrams, the head of Standard Oil of New Jersey, had to say. They spoke of their job as CEOs as a trusteeship on behalf of all the stakeholders in the corporation. They talked about stakeholder capitalism. By that they meant all the different groups that had a stake in the success of the corporation. The owners, of course, the shareholders, of course, but the managers as well, the employees, the suppliers, the creditors, the customers, the communities in which these corporations operated. Everybody should share together. They also frowned on the idea that the head of the corporation and the top executives should make a lot of money by trading in their own company's stock, because obviously they had inside information about whether or not their company was going to shut down plants or build plants or come out with a new product or do something good or do something bad. So they knew when to invest in their own company stock and when not to invest in it. So it was frowned on. That was not done then. Completely different from today, when the biggest portion of the pay of most CEOs is in the form of stock grants or stock options. So there was an ethic at work there that said share the wealth. And it not only said share the wealth, but it said there's a virtuous circle of growth at work. If a lot of companies, American companies, are paying their workers well, their rank and file workers, and those workers, tens of millions of them, go out and they spend their earnings, and middle class people tend to spend almost all of their earnings. They saved a bit, but not a lot. That created robust demand, which generated the drive for the next round of growth. It forced companies to expand their production, to build new plants, to buy new equipment, to hire new workers, and to move on to the next platform of growth. Now, it wasn't a time without problems. It wasn't a time without poverty. It wasn't a time without the rise and fall of business cycles. But generally speaking, it was a time of higher highs and higher lows. The economy was going up like this on a stair-step basis. And part of it was this belief of the business leaders. And instructors and teachers of business ethics in business schools, like Peter Drucker, a famous California business management guru at that time. And there was one other important underpinning of the middle class prosperity of that time, and that was middle class political power. And we don't tend to assume in most of our dialogues that power and economics go together, but they do. If you look at American history and you see high periods of economic inequality, you tend to see high inequality of the American political system. And when you see periods of great compression in salaries and incomes in America, you tend to see periods where the middle class is exercising power. And certainly the 50s, 60s, and 70s were that kind of period. I myself personally covered the civil rights movement, which was one of the great movements of the last half century in terms of expanding the circle of American democracy, increasing the opportunity for a group of people who had been excluded and treated as second-class citizens to be included, at least in legal terms, as first-class citizens, and having the right to use drinking fountains, to use interstate buses, to stay in hotels, to eat at restaurants, to vote. Eventually to vote. And those protests, and I covered many of them in Albany, Georgia, and Mississippi, and Birmingham, Alabama, all around the South, desegregation of the University of Mississippi and so forth, sit-ins in Nashville, Tennessee. You know, the March on Washington, which in August 28th, 1963, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of that great march, which in my opinion was one of the great days of my life, just simply to be there and to see that. Within a year, Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which opened up public accommodations. And after the great Selma voting march, at which John Lewis was clubbed unconsciousness and a lot of other people were arrested, and which raised an enormous uproar in the country, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. But it wasn't just civil rights. The environmental movement was incredible. On Earth Day 1970, April 22nd, 20 million Americans participated in protests across the country. They marched in the streets and parades. They gathered in shopping malls. They gathered at places like Northwestern University. They had talkathons. They were on the air. And they said the fouling of America's waters and America's air was intolerable. It was outrageous, and they weren't going to accept it, and they were protesting. There were lots of other protests, but that was the apotheosis. That was the peak, the acme of that protest. Within a year, Congress had passed 7 major pieces of environmental legislation: Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Anti-Toxic Substances Act, 3 more. And that great tree-hugging environmentalist Richard Nixon, Republican president, signed all those bills. In fact, Nixon, who was no environmentalist — I was being sarcastic, I didn't hear any titters, so I thought maybe I better tell you. I talked to Bill Ruckelshaus, who was Nixon's first head of the EPA. And I said to him, so how did Nixon feel about the environment? He said, you know, I didn't meet with Nixon much. He wasn't really very interested in the environment. But when I did meet with him, he said he never asked me anything. He never said, Bill, is it really bad? Or what's the worst thing? Is it the rivers? Or are the cities doing it? Are the corporations doing it? He said he didn't care. He said, but he responded. He responded to public demand. He responded to the public outcry. And then Ruckelshaus said such a simple thing. He says, you know, he was a politician. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. What an interesting thought for today. That's the way democracy is supposed to work. The people speak, and the leaders respond even if they don't agree. And Nixon was a great buddy of CEOs. He was a great admirer of the captains of American industry. I love to go down with him, you know, down in Key Biscayne, Rebozo's place, or San Clemente, whatever. That guy, nonetheless, felt impelled to enact and sign on to environmental legislation. And then there was the consumers movement. Think about it. When you go into a store today and you are shopping and you turn a product over on the back to see what's in it, and they tell you all the contents, it's there because of the consumer movement of the 1970s. Ralph Nader, who wrote Unsafe at Any Speed, accused the auto industry of creating cars in America, making cars in America that were defective. Tires exploded, things went wrong, people were killed, accidents happened, all kinds of injuries. It was an outrage. And the pressure that came from the consumers movement put the heat on industry to upgrade its standards, to make labeling of products more honest, to put pressure on the Food and Drug Administration to set higher standards for food safety in this country, okay? So again, another movement. Women's movement started. Women were making, I think it was 41 cents on the dollar if they had a comparable job to men at that period. And the women's movement put on pressure, and it gradually over the years got pushed up to 52 cents and then 61 cents and then 66 cents. It didn't make it to $1, but it made it way up. It put the heat on industry, put the heat on government. It caused changes in the way America operated, and in the fairness and the levelness of the, if there is such a word, of the playing field in America, the economic playing field. And then the peace movement, of course, had an impact on the war in Vietnam. So there were popular movements across the board on many issues in which people got directly involved. And that was an important underpinning. And maybe the most important movement of all was the labor movement. Very important for the underpinning of the living standards of the middle class. Embodied by many agreements, but perhaps just to pick one, the Treaty of Detroit in 1948, which was the first major union agreement with a major American corporation between the United Auto Workers and the General Motors. And what had happened was there'd been a lot of wildcat strikes coming out of the war after the government lifted the regulations on industry and on unions and so forth. And Charlie Wilson, the CEO of General Motors, said, I want to get back to making cars and making money. And Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers Union, said, fine, you want to do that? We want steady jobs. We want rising pay. We want health benefits. And for the first time in American industrial history, we want pensions, lifetime pensions. By 1980, this was a copycat thing. It was copied by Ford, it was copied by Chrysler, it was copied in the steel industry, the electronics industry, rubber industry, atomic energy industry, you name it. By 1980, 84% of the people who worked for companies with more than 100 employees had lifetime pensions. 84%, 5 out of 6. I couldn't believe the numbers when I went back, and I just saw this economist over here to my left shaking his head. It's amazing. 70% of them had fully paid employer health benefits, okay? Today the number is 18%. Number of pensions is 30%, and probably the only reason is that is a lot of them have pensions that come from that old period there. They're certainly not new pensions coming out. So that became the underpinning, that became the floor under the living standards of the middle class in America. So what happened? Two things happened. Two important trends began in the late 1970s, one in the field of economics and one in politics. Let me take politics first. What's interesting is that the very power and activism of the middle class movements that I've just mentioned, like Newton's law, created an equal and positive, or actually more powerful, and negative reaction. One of the leading corporate attorneys of that time was a guy named Lewis Powell. Is that name familiar to anybody? All right, a couple of people. Lewis Powell was named to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon in 1971. He began his service in 1972. Powell was a famous corporate attorney, famous enough to have become elected president of the American Bar Association. He came out of Richmond, very soft-spoken, Tidewater drawl kind of guy, shuffled around the Supreme Court in his shirt sleeves and slippers, and occasionally people would mistake him when he was on the Supreme Court for the custodian and ask him the way to the men's room. But Powell was anything but soft-spoken. He was an ardent advocate of the free enterprise system. He was an inimical enemy of trade unions, labor unions, organized labor. He hated organized labor and minced no words about it. And he was very disturbed about all the trends I was just talking about, the environmental controls, the regulation. He was particularly concerned, interestingly enough, about the regulations imposed on business by the Nixon administration. Never said it about Nixon personally in public, but he railed against the OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, against the EPA, against the Mine Safety Board, Traffic Safety Commission, all those things that got established, by the way, under Nixon as a Republican president. Again, something that is often forgotten in today's debates about whether or not we should have government regulation or not. Nixon believed in regulating the American free enterprise system in order to make it more competitive and to make it last longer and be more effective. His idea was that if you had a fair, more competitive playing field, we would actually do better, that it wouldn't restrain and hurt business. But in any case, Powell didn't feel that way. And Powell was talking to some friends of his at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and was railing against some of these things that I've just mentioned. And they said, well, why don't you write us a paper about that? So Powell sat down, he wrote a thing which is now known in American history as the Powell Memorandum. Powell Memorandum was written in August of 1971, and Powell was an unlikely Paul Revere, but this was a call to arms to corporate America to get into the political arena. At that point, even though American business had been very much involved in Washington back in the 1880s and 1890s, and again in the 1920s, after the New Deal, after the war, business had sort of retreated from the political arena. And Powell said, you've got to get back into the political arena. Labor consumers, environmental, women, all these movements, they're taken to the cleaners. You've got to go identify your enemies. You've got to go after them aggressively. You've got to take the political high ground. You've got to organize for the long run, and you've got to pool your money. In what could have been a long time foreshadowing, in fact, political action committees were starting to begin then a foreshadowing of the super PACs and the activities we've just seen in the last couple of election cycles here. He wrote this memo, handed it to his buddies at the Chamber of Commerce, and they circulated it among business leaders. Now, they circulated it privately. We didn't know anything about this. Matter of fact, I gave a talk about 2 or 3 months ago at the home of Mark Shields, the Washington Post columnist. There were 40 or 50 well-known Washington journalists there, people like Jim Lehrer of PBS, Bob Schieffer of Face the Nation, and many others like that. There was only one other reporter in the room besides myself who had ever heard of the Powell memo. That's how private it was. So believe you me, when it was going on in the 70s, we didn't know what was going on. What's interesting is, within 4 months of the Powell memo, the Business Roundtable was formed. The Business Roundtable was formed by 150 or 160 of the largest blue ribbon corporations in America. You know all the names, all the household names that you can possibly imagine. GM, GE, IBM, and so forth, right down the line. They'd never organized before, and they organized in response to this memo. They are now the single most powerful voice politically of business in Washington today. It's very difficult to pass any legislation that the Business Roundtable unanimously opposes and fights. At the time Powell wrote his memo, there were 175 companies, only 175 companies that had offices in Washington to work with the government, not just to lobby Congress, but also to work with the executive branch on regulations and so forth. By 1980, there were 2,425, from 175 to 2,425. By 1980, there were 50,000 people working for business trade associations in Washington. There were 9,000 registered corporate lobbyists. There were 8,000 registered corporate PR people. There were 130 corporate lobbyists for every single member of Congress. I call it Powell's Army. Nobody else calls it Powell's Army. We didn't know it was Powell's Army. Only in retrospect we found out that it was Powell's Army. But what we did see, interestingly enough, is a shift of power and a shift of impact in the politics of America and the policies of America. And interestingly enough, when I went back and looked at it, it occurred before Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, which is the period that most people think of as the time of change. It actually occurred in 1978 when the Democrats were in control of Congress and Jimmy Carter was sitting in the White House. At that point, with a Democratic president and Democratic control of Congress, organized labor thought they were going to get the laws they wanted. They were going to get new labor, what they called labor law reform, organizing reform that would roll back the Landrum-Griffin Act or provisions of the Landrum-Griffin Act and the Taft-Hartley Act, which put restrictions on the ability of labor to organize. They were going to get some other pieces of legislation. Ralph Nader in the consumer movement was looking to establish the Consumer Protection Bureau. Interesting. 1978. It got passed in 2010. So all that time before, 42 years earlier, they were working on that. Those bills never got out of Congress. Powell's Army went to work. They lobbied the heck out of the Democrats. Some of the Democrats had been elected in previously Republican, long-time Republican districts. They were nervous about running for re-election. They were vulnerable to this kind of lobbying. So the business lobbying army blocked the stuff, what you might say, on the left, center left, and then they went to work. They got the 401k program put into the tax code. A 401k program meant an enormous shift, not then, but later on. It prefigured an enormous shift of costs from the corporate books to the pocketbooks and the checkbooks of ordinary Americans, okay? Hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And that's been going on now, certainly for the last 20, 25 years, not the entire time since 1978. In that same Congress, they changed the corporate bankruptcy law. Bankruptcy, when it used to occur, was turned over, a company was turned over to a bankruptcy referee. The idea being that bankruptcy is pain. Everybody's going to lose. A lot of people are going to suffer economically. Turn it over to a neutral. Leaders of the corporations didn't like that. They said, why don't you leave the existing management of the corporation in charge during the bankruptcy period? So the law got changed to eliminate the referees and to leave management in charge. Didn't make much difference for a while. There weren't too many bankruptcies, but when you get to the 1990s and the 2000s, and you start to see bankruptcies ripple through the steel industry, Bethlehem, LTV, Weirton, and then the airlines, United, Delta, Eastern, and finally American. It's the employees who take the big hits along with the stockholders. I track the United bankruptcy in my book, and in the United bankruptcy, the employees lost $4 billion in wages, health benefits, and retirement benefits. And by the way, the legal fees paid by the corporations to get those concessions amounted to $400 million. I talked to the chief lawyer for United. He didn't want to tell me what it cost, but he finally admitted that it cost $400 million. I said, that's pretty heavy. $4 billion out of the pockets of the employees. Management has retained shares in the new company, and you've walked away with $400 million. Big shift of money there. That's the kind of thing that happened. That started with that 1978 legislature. The next thing that happened in the 1978 Congress was they passed a bill to eliminate the lid on interest rates, the ceiling on interest rates. At that time, states had laws that put usury laws that set limits on the interest rates that banks could charge on mortgages, on home loans, on car loans, on student loans, on all kinds of ordinary credit. They said we can't loan to people who are bad risks unless we can run the interest rate up to 15, 18, 20% instead of 4, 5, 6%. And so Congress said, oh, that sounds reasonable, so we'll go along with that. I don't know if you've noticed, if you don't pay your full balance on your credit card, even if you're a prime credit risk today and you're not a low risk, you're still going to pay 18, 20, 22%. Those interest rates that started as a result of 1978 legislation are with us today. And then finally, the tax system got changed. Jimmy Carter was going to raise the taxes on the wealthy, close some loopholes, raise the corporate taxes a little bit, drop some lower income people off the income tax returns and the income tax system. And when the law came back, rewritten by Congress, the loopholes were not closed, the lower income people were not dropped, the corporate tax rate was not raised, it was lowered. And the biggest change was the capital gains tax was dropped from 48% to 28%. Now, obviously, that benefits all stockholders if you get your capital gains lowered to 28%. But if you realize that the top 5% of wealth in this country owns 2/3 of the stock in the stock market, then you realize that it was an enormous gain for the people at the top and not much for the people down below. So all those changes moved in the direction that Powell had wanted, Powell had advocated, because finally they deregulated the trucking industry and the telecommunications industry. So things were moving. It got accelerated under Reagan. There was a bit of moving back under Clinton. It got accelerated even more under George W. Bush in the 2000s. But we're living with the power change that was started by the Powell memo and the what you might call the revolt of the bosses that occurred back in the 1970s. And even more striking with the banks. I mean, the relationship between the banks and Washington is very close. It's interesting that even in a Democratic administration, all three chiefs of staff, until the brand new one that's come in now, first three chiefs of staff of Barack Obama all worked on Wall Street before they worked at the White House. And obviously previously in the Clinton administration, Bob Rubin, the Secretary of the Treasury, and even Larry Summers, the Deputy Secretary of Treasury and later on Treasury Secretary, worked on Wall Street. And then when we had the financial collapse, the head of Goldman Sachs took over, as Hank Paulson took over as Treasury Secretary. So the influence of Wall Street has been growing steadily over time. This is what we've been living with, this power shift. And there's a vacuum on the other side. There isn't any countervailing power. Unions have gotten weaker, and the citizens' movement of the middle class are now non-existent. So that's what's happened in our politics. We had a parallel change going on in the economic system. I mentioned before that the middle class had benefited from the rising productivity and the rising growth of the American economy in those 30 years after World War II. Remember, 97% growth in productivity, 95% growth in middle class compensation salaries. From 1975 until 2011, 1978 till 2011, the productivity of the American workforce, according to the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, rose 80%. And the average income compensation of the median family rose 10%. 80% and 10%. So what I call wedge economics began to affect the American economy starting in the late 1970s. A wedge was kind of driven into the side of the American economy. And if you lived and earned above that wedge, the further above that wedge, the better you did. And if you lived right at that wedge, you went nowhere. Census Bureau told us in 2011 that the median male pay hourly pay in 2011 was identical to the pay in 1978, adjusted for inflation. 30 years of going nowhere. What happened there? Part of it was the decline of the unions, no countervailing power. But part of it was a complete change in the ideology of the business leadership. I was talking before about stakeholder capitalism. We moved from stakeholder capitalism to shareholder capitalism. If you hear it now, you hear it all the time, quoted in the press. You hear business leaders saying, our function is to deliver the maximum return to our shareholders. I think first really articulated in a major essay by Milton Friedman, the famous Chicago Nobel laureate in economics, in 1960. But it became the mantra much later, really in the 1980s. And you began to see a shift. You see a shift, it's amazing, right at General Motors. Reg Jones is succeeded by Jack Welch. Reg Jones used to talk about the loyalty to the company of the employees and the loyalty of the company to its employees. And Jack Welch said, loyal to the company, it's nonsense. We just have to deliver maximum return to the shareholders. Welch became the ultimate manager of the 1990s. I think he was actually called that by Fortune magazine, and Business Week called him the gold standard of 20th century American managers. And his hallmark was cutting costs, cutting factories, cutting work, cutting jobs. He cut about a quarter, about 120,000 people, 120,000 jobs at General Electric when he was there. In fact, he was known, his nickname was Neutron Jack, for the weapon that destroys, that kills people but leaves the building standing. And I remember reading a Fortune article who said, quoted several executives about what it was like, anonymously, what it was like to work for Jack Welch. And one guy said, working for Welch is like war. He said, a lot of people get hurt, really badly hurt. And this is an executive. This is not a rank and file employee talking. That became the style. And that became what Wall Street was rewarding. That became what Wall Street was looking for. And one of the main reasons it became that was they changed the idea of this whole how CEOs should be paid. There was this notion that CEOs of companies and managers might not think the way the owners of the companies thought. They might not have the same motivation. So the way to give them the same motivation would be to pay them with stock, either give them large stock grants or give them stock options. And then they would think more like stockholders. And so what happened in the process was having the stock price rise became the measure of a CEO's success. That's what CEOs began to look for. And I've interviewed CEOs, I've done stories about CEOs, I've got them in my book, and one of them in particular, Al Dunlop at Sunbeam, was typical. He had a stock ticker right out his office door with large numbers, so that every time he walked in and out of his office or anybody came in and out of his office, everybody saw what the stock of Sunbeam was. That was the focus. Now, it went bananas. That idea was actually conjured by Mike Jensen, an associate professor of business at Harvard Business School, and one of his colleagues at Rochester University, both of them students of Milton Friedman, with this idea of motivating the CEOs to think in stockholder terms. What happened is that business leaders are pretty canny. They figure out how to beat the game. We were talking about that earlier this afternoon in your office, Marty. They figure out how to make the rules work to their favor. And so they began to manipulate the way they would talk the stock up just before they'd get their stock options, or just after they got their stock options, and they would cash in. And then sometimes it didn't work. And so if it didn't work and their stock price was $40 when they got their stock options, they could exercise at $40. They were figuring they were going to make money if the stock went up to $50. They'd make $10 a share if you got 1 million shares. And 1 million shares was not an unusual stock grant to be given to a CEO. You'd make $10 million like that in a day without having to worry the way a shareholder does of whether or not the stock is going to go up or down. You just wait. But what happens when the stock goes down after the options are granted? It goes down to 35. The CEO goes into the board and they say, you're not paying me. This is terrible. I'm not getting rewarded. I should be paid. How about giving me new options at 30? Well, they're not allowed under the law to give it at a false price that's not real at the time. So what they did is they backdated the options to a time when the stock actually was at 30 or at 25 or at 20. 800, 900 major American corporations indulged in this kind of stock cheating. That's been documented. Apple, one of the cardinal examples of the success of American innovation and successful management, Steve Jobs and Apple's were involved in stock manipulation. They denied it for years, and they finally admitted to the SEC that in over 6,000 cases, 6,000 times, I think it's 6,428, but I'm not sure, it's over 6,000, they changed the date of the options, that the options were granted so that their executives could make more money. They initially denied that Steve Jobs had been involved at all with this, had nothing to do with it, never benefited from all. It was phony as a $3 bill. In fact, he had, and not only had he benefited, but when they did it with Steve Jobs and some other guys, they actually fabricated a meeting of the board of directors that never took place. It was fictional. They happened to pick a bad date. There had never been a board meeting. I mean, options are only granted by the board at board meetings, and they usually backdated them to an earlier meeting. In this case, they made up a meeting wholly out of whole cloth, and Jobs made $275 million by selling half of the stock options he got. I never found out whether or not he sold the other half, but he made a lot of money. And this was going on throughout. Even Mike Jensen, the Harvard Business School professor, was disillusioned and said at one point that stock options had become managerial heroin, that people were addicted to them. He didn't, however, suggest that we change the system. He said we should make some refinements in it so cheating was harder. So what was going on was this enormous explosion, this skyrocketing of wealth, which has led to a hyper-concentration of wealth in this country, while the middle class has been stagnating. So we've had a political trend, and we've had an economic trend, which has left the middle class stuck in the rut. And not only the middle class, it's left the economy stuck in a rut. Because there are now some pretty good economic studies out that show that high inequality of income is bad for growth, not good for growth. That growth actually occurs better when there's this great compression going on, when there's this virtuous circle of growth working. And that high inequality of, and I saw one study that said high inequality of income is destructive. The word was destructive to growth. So this is bad not just for the middle class. This is not just unfair. This is not just an unlevel playing field. It's not even smart economics. So the question is, what do we do about it? Maybe before I go to that, maybe I just ought to share with you a thought from a couple of very wise people who spotted this problem, because it's not brand new, quite a while ago. Louis Brandeis, a century ago, former advisor to President Wilson, later a member of the Supreme Court appointed by by President Wilson, said, "We must make our choice. We may have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." A century ago, today's conditions. John Gardner, who was in Lyndon Johnson's cabinet, said this about a decade ago: "We are treading the edge of a precipice here. Civilizations die of disenchantment. If enough people doubt their society, the whole venture falls apart. We must never let anger, fashionable cynicism, or political partisanship blur our vision on that point. We must not despair of the Republic." I guess there are a lot of people who will say, and with good reason, well, Rick, you're describing this enormous income gap. You're describing a starkly unequal democracy. But isn't this just really the result of market forces and advancing technology and globalization? Isn't this just unavoidable, the dynamics of economics and technology? And it's unquestionable that the emergence of China, and before it Japan, and the entrance to the world market of hundreds of millions of people, a labor force of hundreds of millions of people who will work for much less, has had an impact. But if you talk to the CEOs of major American corporations today and ask them why they move plants to China, they will cite the labor costs, but not so much. They used to do it much more in the 80s than they do now. They will say we need to be near the markets that we want to sell to, and those are massive markets. They will admit privately, they don't like to talk about it much publicly, that there's enormous pressure put on them by the Chinese government, that if they want to sell to the Chinese market, then they've got to move their technologies and their production to China. But more importantly, they will say it's the subsidies the Chinese give that is so attractive, so powerfully attractive to them. Craig Barrett, the former CEO of Intel, said, I can build a chip fab, a modern chip fabrication plant in China for $1 billion less than I can in America. I get free land, or land at almost virtually free. I get free roads, electricity, power, water, all the things I need to run a plant, run in there, and I don't have to pay for it. And I usually get a tax abatement for 10, 15, 20 years. And the net effect is the capital cost. Now, this is not labor costs. The capital cost to me is $1 billion less. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have to confront that. The second thing that's interesting to me is that when you look around the world, if it's strictly globalization and market forces, then we ought to see a whole bunch of other countries that look exactly like America. But when the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, 34 member countries, put out its last report on income inequality in the world, the United States was the third most extreme in the world. The only two countries that were worse than the United States were Mexico and Chile. So if you were worried about America becoming a banana republic, don't worry anymore, we're there. But more importantly, and by the way, this isn't just Paul Krugman and Joe Stiglitz and the Keynesian liberal economists. Citibank put out a brochure in 2005 that I found that said the inequality of income in America was the greatest since 16th century Spain. This is Citibank, and it's advising its best customers only invest in companies that produce for the top 1 or 2%, because there's so much wealth concentrated in that part of the American public that you really don't want to invest in companies that are going after the middle class or even the upper middle class. So this is a very practical piece of market information that confirms what people on the other side are saying. The other thing that's interesting, apropos of the OECD report, is that if you look at some other countries, particularly look at a country like Germany, which is the world's fourth largest trading power, behind the United States and China and Japan, it has had to face the same Chinese low wages, the same Indian rise in software and computers that we have, the Asian tigers, Hong Kong and Singapore and Korea and Taiwan, that we have faced. But they've had a very different experience. Since 1985, big German corporations have raised the pay of average workers 5 times faster than American corporations have. And the American corporations said they couldn't do it because they couldn't compete globally if they did it, which should mean that the major German corporations should be out of business and Germany should be in real trouble. Well, I haven't noticed that Daimler-Benz and BMW and Airbus and Siemens have been in deep trouble globally. And if you look at the trade picture from 2000 to 2010, the United States ran up a $6 trillion trade deficit during that period. We bought $6 trillion more stuff from the world, particularly from China, than we sold. At the same time, Germany had a $2 trillion trade surplus. They sold $2 trillion worth of stuff. As a matter of fact, the biggest market outside of Germany from BMWs is in China. And that's just one of many examples that I could pick. But what's really interesting is that we've been told in this modern globalized economy, we can no longer bet on manufacturing, that it is passé. Its era is over. We used to be a farm economy, then we became a manufacturing economy. Now to compete in the world, we must become a service economy. Iron law of economics, not a question that we can possibly debate. Well, what's interesting is if you look at the United States, we have 9% of our workforce in manufacturing. It's dropped from about 16 or 17% over the last 15 years, but particularly sharply over the last 10 years. Germany has 21% of its workforce in manufacturing. Important because manufacturing jobs are the best high-tech jobs, best paying jobs, with the best benefits usually for middle-class workers. But not just for middle-class workers, but for all the engineers and the designers and the marketing people and the advertising people and the executives. And then, of course, the banks and the auto dealerships and the real estate firms and the grocery stores and so forth that get the benefit of the multiplying effect of creating manufacturing jobs. So somehow Germany has done this in the face of the same conditions where we have not done this. Now, what that says to me, it tends to confirm the picture. That is, decisions and values and changes that have happened inside America, as much as the changes that have happened outside America, that have determined our great inequality of income and with it, our great inequality of politics. What do we do about it? I've talked too long already. There are all kinds of things that can be done. We have a tax system that rewards companies for moving their production overseas. They get a lower tax rate till they bring their profits back, and when they bring their profits back, they all gang up together, go lobby Congress, and they get a very, very low tax rate, even lower than they would get if we lowered our general corporate tax rate. So one thing we could do would be to make the corporate tax rate level and not penalize companies that keep jobs in America and make them pay 35% and let the others who move lots of jobs overseas pay less. We have an infrastructure in this country, a transportation system of ports, airports, roads, bridges, railroads that is way out of date. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce says we're losing $1 trillion worth of growth by the inefficiencies of our transportation systems. It's costing us $200 billion a year in freight bottlenecks, just moving freight trains around the country. It takes as long to move a freight train through the city of Chicago, your dear hometown, as it does to move it all the way from Los Angeles to Chicago. We could fix those things like that if we spent some money on infrastructure. We could do something to bail out the homeowners and make the banks adjust the way they refinance the loans since they got bailed out by us, the taxpayers. Initially, the TARP program, Troubled Asset Relief Program, was intended to relieve the troubled assets, that is the bad mortgages. So we could finish the job that we started and never finished. There are a lot of things we could do, but I don't think any of those things are going to happen very fast, and maybe not at all, unless we re-engage as citizens. We got to get back to the frame of mind that people had in the 60s and 70s that says Washington is not going to change on its own, that says as long as the pronoun in our sentence discussing politics says they got to fix it, it isn't going to get fixed. They actually like it the way it is now. The lobbyists are making, it's a growth industry. It's a boom industry. They love it. And the politicians who are in power, they like it the way it is now. And by the way, almost half the members of Congress are millionaires. It's interesting, this bill they brought up, you got to pass a budget or you won't get paid. Half of them won't even notice. They're millionaires. So we've got to put the pressure on them. We got to understand it's up to us. If we want gun control, we want immigration reform, we want a level playing field, we want to create jobs, we want to take care of some of the human deficits in our society instead of just the financial deficits, then we're going to have to push. And people will say to me, well, we can't do it. Look at it. It's stacked. It's too tough. There are too many guns on the other side. Well, what do you think it was like if you were Rosa Parks in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, and you had lived your entire life under Jim Crow, and your mother had said to you, never raise your head, never resist authority, never attract the attention of the law, stay away from the sheriff, stay away from the cop on the beat, don't offend white people, keep your head down, go to the back of the bus. And then one day, you and your friends say, this is not right. Why should we sit in the back of the bus? Why can't we sit anywhere we want? Or drink at the drinking fountains, or eat at the lunch counters, or ride on the buses, or vote. So that's how it started. People like that. One day she got on and they said, sat down in the front of the bus and they said, lady, and they probably didn't say lady, but I'm not going to say what they said. You got to get to the back of the bus. And she said, I'm not going. And they said, if you don't go, you're going to get arrested. She said, all right, arrest me. So they arrested her. They arrested a bunch of others. And then there was a bus boycott. Think of it. It went on. I met John Lewis when he was 20 years old, and they were marching in their Sunday best from the colleges in Nashville, Tennessee, from Vanderbilt, from Fisk, from Baptist Theological Seminary. And they marched downtown, and they got pelted by segregationists when they were sitting down at the lunch counters and dragged off the stools and arrested. And the attorneys and the doctors in town put up their houses as collateral to get them out of jail so they could march down and get arrested again. I watched them in Birmingham. The police dogs and the hoses went after them, and they kept coming and they kept coming. And they finally got to the March on Washington. And on that day, Martin Luther King not only said, I have a dream that one day my daughters can sit down and eat with little white boys and be treated as equals. And I have a dream, and I have a dream. He said, we have come here today to cash a promissory note from American democracy that all men and all women, yes, black men and black women, are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're at a moment like that in America, I really believe. I think we're in deep trouble as a society. We're in deep trouble. And as a journalist, I feel as though we, as newspaper people, and print people and television people have an obligation to tell folks what the score really is, and not to repeat some of the chivalrous and conventional wisdom that we know to be wrong. We have a job as umpires, calling balls and strikes, calling foul and fair, and leveling with people and trying to get at what has really been going on in this country and what is going on today. And then we as a people have got to get to that Rosa Parks moment when we say, I'm not going to the back of the bus anymore. I'm going to get together with my neighbors and we're going to make this a better country. Thank you. Well, I've used up all my time, but maybe they'll give you a couple of moments for questions or throwing rotten eggs or tomatoes or whatever you want. Is there any water up here?
Can you hear it?
I got you.
Okay. I'm curious about two things. You were talking about Gardner's statements about the all of us getting engaged. The Occupy movement is a perfect example of that. Why has the press not handled it in a manner that makes it clear what they were trying to accomplish? And the same thing you can argue with the Tea Party, which became much more visible.
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. I comment on the Tea Party and on the Occupy movement in my book. And as I thought about it and watched it, and I thought back to the civil rights movement, particularly that I knew up close, but the other movements as well, Occupy was a very important moment in American political and economic history. They voiced a cry of discontent at the concentration of wealth and power in this country, and particularly at the power of the Wall Street banks. And it resonated. There were opinion polls done very quickly, and they were reported on, by the way, in the media. I read them. That's how I know about it. And clearly there was a majority of people that sided with the point of view that Occupy was expressing. But I kept looking for stories, and then I even went down to the Occupy people in Washington, D.C., and talked to them about what it was they wanted to achieve. What was their overarching vision? Because all the movements that I know of had a vision. The vision of the civil rights movement was to do away with Jim Crow, to do away with discrimination. But they also had very practical goals. We want to drink at the drinking fountains, we want to ride the bus and so on. So you knew exactly where they wanted to go, and there was a chance to actually negotiate with them. In Birmingham, which I spent a lot of time with, eventually the mayor negotiated, and those things were changed in Birmingham. And that happened in Nashville and other places too. I could never get, and my colleagues in the press, and I've talked to them about it, and I just read them, could get the group in Occupy to declare what their specific goals were. What did they want the banks to do? What did they want the government to do about what they saw as the economic injustice? So it was a protest, but in my opinion, it really wasn't a movement. It didn't have a way of articulating goals, identifying a leadership. I mean, there were some instances, I remember in Denver, they even named a monkey in the local zoo as their leader. They wanted to be kind of a pure Vermont town meeting where everybody was equal and everybody could say what they wanted. But the net effect of it was it didn't coalesce around goals. So I would say, in fact, that it wasn't a movement. I would agree with you. To my disappointment, the Tea Party has been a movement. It's been very effective about saying they want to cut government, they want to cut taxes. They actually want to protect the tax rate of the people in the top brackets, and they want to do away with lots of programs, and they'll tell you which programs they want to do away with. They've managed to run candidates for Congress. The candidates have run and won, and they managed to attract money, and they probably attracted money from billionaires and those who wanted that viewpoint represented. But there are some billionaires in this country who feel on the other side, and they haven't felt attracted to Occupy as a comparable movement. I think we've got a lot of faults in the media. I think there are lots of things that we haven't done. I don't happen to think in the case of Occupy the problem was under coverage. I think Occupy itself didn't know enough what it wanted to do and where it wanted to take the country. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my reaction. So was there somebody? Yes, sir.
Taking you back to Russia a little bit. I know you've been talking about the U.S., but perhaps you can
you
do some
point it right at your mouth?
Perhaps you can do some comparative work. The U.S. has had a boom in oil and gas production recently, with states like North Dakota getting very, very low unemployment, and with Pennsylvania having rapidly rising incomes and employment. And at the same time, that increase in production and decline in imports in the U.S. in oil and gas is affecting Russia because they're losing their pricing power.
Sure.
Ukraine is beginning to use these same fracking technologies to start to replace Russian gas. And so I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about sort of technological and economic trends in that perspective and globally.
Yeah, well, there's no question that the rise, hope I don't slide off the stage here, that the rise of the new fracking technology and the growth, explosive growth that's taking place in natural gas all across the country here is one of the great potentials for the American economy now. I mean, I'm told, I don't follow this field very closely, but I'm told that the cost of natural gas in America is 1/10 the cost in Japan and Asia and 1/5 the cost in Europe. So it's an enormous cost advantage suddenly being given to the kinds of industries in this country that use gas in their production and can give us a benefit much more widely. I hope that we can pass legislation that both controls the fracking in terms of the environment but also encourages it. So that's a tremendous benefit for us, and we should seize on that. Clearly, it does exactly what you said. It's going to take any established energy producer like Russia, but not only Russia, hopefully Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iraq and a bunch of others as well, Venezuela, some other folks that we don't always have such close relationships with. It's going to reduce their bargaining power, their negotiating power in the market. But that's going to depend a lot on how rapidly we can not only develop the resources, but the pipelines and the energy conversion technologies that we need to exploit this. I don't know how to go beyond your excellent observation except to say that I agree with you. And it is going to pose tremendous problems, particularly for the Russians, because they depend so heavily on the export of raw materials, all kinds. I mean, chromium and platinum and all kinds of metals, but most particularly oil, and oil even more than natural gas. It's going to hurt their bargaining power. It's going to hurt their economy. But I have to say, despite all my long interest in Russia, at the moment I'm much more interested in America and what we can do here. And I'm sorry for the Russians. I think the Russians ought to be far more engaged in the world economy than they are. I think Putin is moving in absolutely the wrong direction. I think Medvedev might have moved more in the right direction. And I feel sorry for them, and I think it's unfortunate. But I'm much more concerned that we take the advantage of what we've just stumbled into or worked our way into. And hope it delivers a lot for us in this country. Yes, sir. I'll get to you next. He's got the mic, but I'll get it down to you next.
You made a glancing reference to investigative journalism at the beginning of your talk. But the fact remains that the number of investigative journalists is decreasing and has been for a number of years. And I'm wondering if you think there might be a relationship between that and the cutting of the cost to have them and the fact that so many of the news media, whether it be TV, papers, or whatever, are being run by people that also own big businesses, going back to your theory about the business group, so that it's not just government who's afraid, but business who's afraid that things will be exposed.
Oh, I don't think there's any question about it. I think you're right on both points. I can tell you from my own experience, having worked in Russia in a police state, having covered strategic arms negotiations, which were kept highly secret while they were going on, or people tried to keep them secret, having worked on stories about the CIA and the Pentagon, and having covered business, that business is the toughest story to cover. The people in business are in control of their information. They give out what they want to give out. They don't give out what they don't want to give out. And it takes enormous energy, knowledge of economics, and tenacity and determination on the part of the reporters to get this stuff out. I can tell you the stuff that I did for Frontline over the last several years on economics and on this book was some of the hardest reporting I've ever done in 50 years of reporting. So number one, I'd agree with you on the challenge. Number two, there's absolutely no question that as more corporations take over more ownership of the media, one way or another, they're going to inhibit the kind of reporting that you and I are talking about. Sometimes they're open and naked about it. More often they're covert about it, and it's much harder to find out that it's going on, but it is going on. And so that's going to defeat us. And thirdly, there's the enormous problem of resources. The old model of marketing newspapers in particular, but also television, through advertisements, but particularly newspapers, and getting the revenue more from advertising than from subscriptions to support your news operation, that business model has just gone out the window. And we're scrambling now to try to figure out what other kind of model we can put together that will work financially. Well, as you pointed out, most news organizations have cut back heavily in their news editorial staff, and investigative reporting is one of the first things to go. I remember how sad I felt the day I was at a group of journalists meeting at a foundation in Washington discussing these problems, and a guy from CNN got up who had headed CNN's science unit of 6 reporters and producers working with them, and told us that CNN had eliminated that entire unit. So these were people who specialized in healthcare and climate change and all kinds of scientific discoveries, medical and otherwise, and just following technology in an intelligent way. And their jobs were gone. And so CNN was going to turn over that task to people who were general assignment reporters and throw them at stories. You simply were not going to, get many of the enterprise investigative stories. They simply weren't going to happen. And even when there were reporters assigned to scientific stories, they were going to be reporters who were scrambling that day just to understand as much as they could of the story so they could turn something out, by the next deadline. So the quality of that kind of journalism has gone down terribly. I don't know what we're going to do as a society. I think we're going to have to come to some kind of recognition that, in fact, there is a connection between an effective democracy and an effective organized journalism. We simply cannot get the kind of journalism we need to nourish the body politic in America from people going around with cell phones taking pictures at the right moment. There are going to be an occasional picture taken of a president or somebody else being shot, and everyone's going to say, wow, look at cell phone journalism. But that isn't how we cover most of the news that's important to us in our society. There are people now at work on this. I don't know whether or not you have this going on at Northwestern, but there are people at the UC Berkeley, there are people at American University in Washington, there are people up at Boston University, where they're trying to combine a journalistic workshop, which is funded partly by foundations who want to sustain quality journalism, and particularly investigative journalism, along with marketing the outcome, the output, the way ProPublica does, to establish news outlets, using the university as a place where you can have people who are both teaching students and are operating as active journalists, maybe part-time doing one or the other, where the university is picking up some of the overhead costs, particularly important in the area of equipment, because there's such a rapid turnover in equipment, especially in the visual medium, that it's very hard for. I ran a small company for 20 years. I can tell you, I'm as proud of keeping it alive as a business for 20 years in the economic environment that I was working in as I am of the reporting. I mean it was a constant struggle to make sure that I could pay everybody that I had to pay and keep the projects going and getting them financed. So that's a serious problem that maybe we have to engage a larger audience in. Maybe we have to sit down with President Shapiro and say, how the heck do we set up this kind of center at Northwestern, not just so that we have this wonderful 70 reporter bureau down in Chicago generating stuff, but so that we can tie that in somehow to producing professional output and longer term projects. I mean, the first thing you do with journalists is get them to write the daily story. But then after a bit, you've got to dig under the daily story. For a long time, forgive me, I'm going to philosophize here for a moment, but for a long time, I bought the idea that news is what happened yesterday. I don't think that's right. News is what we didn't know yesterday. And it could have happened 6 years ago, it could have happened 3 months ago. But if it's important and it impacts our lives today, the fact that we discovered it today is what makes it news, not when it happened. Now that takes a different mentality, it takes a different kind of training, it takes a different kind of commitment, and it takes a different kind of training institution. I mean, you've got people like Moyers, you've got places like Frontline, you've got this UC Berkeley workshop that Lowell Bergman is running. You've got places like that are acting as seed beds, as gestation locations for training and bringing up a new generation of journalists with a smart mentality and the kind of mentality we need to generate really modern reporting. But that takes money, it takes time, it takes talent, it takes really smart teachers. It may take an interaction between academic teachers and practitioners, so that you bring the practitioners into the classroom and you take some of the academic practitioners and you put them into practice. In my opinion, we should be doing that all through our economy. We've got high school science and math teachers who have no idea how science and math are actually applied in the work world. They learn their stuff in class and they teach it in class. And the kids know or suspect that the teachers don't know what it's going to mean to the kids the day after they graduate from high school or from college, but particularly from high school. Whereas if maybe we had some of those teachers going out in the summertime, instead of taking a month, 3 months off, working in industry and then coming back and saying, you know, these equations that you're learning or this methodology you're learning or this statistics you're learning is actually relevant to what you're going to do after you get out of here. Now, at the college university level, particularly at the graduate level, there must be a less hard argument, and maybe I'm talking to the wrong bunch of people here, but this whole notion of interchanging practical experience with academic training grounds, it seems to me, is an important potential avenue for us to go in. I don't know, that's more of an answer than you asked for, but I care about it, and if I can contribute anything to the discussion, I'd be happy to. Yes, ma'am, you had a question here.
I missed who you said was the person who advised Lewis Powell to write that memo.
Oh, it was, I can't remember the name of the guy. I think it was a guy named Dobbins who worked at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Okay.
It was one of his friends at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Okay.
Didn't advise him to. What happened was Powell was sounding off, and this guy said, why don't you put it down on paper? I mean, it wasn't as if they prompted Powell to do anything Powell didn't want to do. It's just they responded to him.
Yeah. And just one more question that occurs to me. Have you had any way to learn how your book is going over with Wall Street or politicians, any, that sort of environment?
That's a good question. I don't have a lot of feedback there. I have gotten a few emails from people who are involved in business who say, welcome. I mean, it's time somebody said this stuff, and thank you for laying it out. I have certainly heard from some politicians, but they're politicians that you might expect that I would hear from. The title, Who Stole the American Dream, it doesn't exactly attract a lot of folks from Wall Street to say, wow, I better get a hold of that right away, because it doesn't take a lot of wisdom to figure out where I might be going. But I actually have had some people come back to me. And particularly, what's interesting is, we're in such desperate need in this country of restoring the political center. There are a whole lot of really intelligent Republicans in this country who feel dispossessed, who feel disenfranchised, who feel they've been denied their country. Their party, they say again and again, my party's left me. One of my best friends in Washington is a Republican of that kind. And he just says, I don't know where to go. He said, I'm not entirely comfortable with becoming a Democrat, but he said, this party that's out there just doesn't correspond to me. Now, a guy like that reads my book and says, yeah, I don't agree with everything you've said, but the thesis you've laid down, the description you've given is enormously informative and is helpful, and so there's a positive response. But the people whose income and whose power I'm talking about, it's going to take a pretty large-minded person to say bravo to you. I'm not holding my breath till that happens. If it does happen, I'm delighted. And I think there are, remember when we were having the debate in the campaign in October of 2012, there were a number of multimillionaires and billionaires who came forward and said, I'm willing to pay more taxes. This is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And there were business people who came forward and said the tax rate has nothing to do with whether or not I'm going to hire people or expand. I'm going to hire people or expand based on consumer demand and what I see the market is. And if there's a market there, I'm going to go ahead and do it if the rates are high. So you have had examples of people who were involved in those positions who were talking about life in pragmatist terms, not in ideological terms. But if you're talking about people who are basically political ideologues, then they're going to regard me as the enemy, I guess. I'm trying to talk to as many, and I've got examples in my book of effective CEOs. I mean, one of my heroes is a guy named Jim Sinegal who runs Costco. And Jim Sinegal at Costco takes an annual salary of $2 million a year. His competitor at Walmart takes $20 million. Walmart said it couldn't continue its health benefits for its employees. Costco responded by saying, we feel a responsibility and an obligation to deliver health benefits so that we're not throwing our employees on the communities where they live, the health system in the communities where they live. We owe that to them, to their families, and the communities we operate in. So there are examples of people who operate a very different way. I mean, Jeffrey Immelt, the head of GE, has moved a lot of their production overseas, and he says, I would happily have many more jobs for GE here. We want to make money, but you got to change the tax system here if you want me to bring the jobs back. So there are people who are pretty open about it. You have people like what the heck was the guy who was Norm Augustine, who used to be the head of Lockheed Martin. And a whole bunch of other people have joined with the National Academy of Sciences, and they're saying, we're losing the R&D race in America. We've been losing it for the last 10 or 15 years. We need the government to put in some pump priming money to get us back to where we were. Now, other businessmen will say getting the government involved and taking government money is anathema. All I'm saying is there's more division in that community than appears. Leo Hendry, another guy who used to be CEO of AT&T Broadband, has gotten together with a bunch of former CEOs and top executives, and they're talking about having a domestic Marshall Plan for American manufacturing to bring American manufacturing back. Andy Grove, former CEO of Intel, says you can't count on individual companies to help the national economy. We're all pursuing our own self-interest, and sometimes that means moving production abroad. And when we move production abroad, we start to move R&D and engineering abroad, and the country is going to suffer if we're going to turn this around, creating jobs and bringing jobs back. These are almost his exact words. It's up to the government to take the lead. So I've just given you an example of half a dozen business leaders who have, in one way or another, and I quote them in my book, who have endorsed the kind of policies I'm talking about. So there's not unanimity there, but there's a conventional wisdom, and we in the press are as guilty as anybody because we keep repeating the dominant argument that comes out of the business community, and we rarely quote the ones that I was just quoting to you. And so the public has the impression that it's a monolithic response on the other side. Have I outlasted my welcome? I think maybe I have.
If anyone has any other questions, we're going to have a reception out in the lobby. There's also copies of Mr. Smith's book for sale. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you for coming.